Hello and welcome again to our consideration of the upcoming readings for this now the 25th Sunday of the year, the B year, remember the year of Mark. The readings chosen for this week first comes from the book of Wisdom, chapter 2, verse 12, and then verses 17 through 20. We continue to hear sections from the letter of James, this time the third chapter, verses 16, then through chapter 4, verse 3. So that kind of runs as a unit there. And the gospel chapter from Mark is 9, verses 30 through 37. So once again, let's back up to where we were last week with regard to Mark's gospel. Remember that it had pictured Jesus at a place called Caesarea Philippi, and that it was there that he had issued the first of three predictions as Mark creates them or puts them into Jesus' teaching of what will happen when he comes to the city of Jerusalem. Now, that had ended where Jesus, in the section of that was chapter 8, had ended with chapter 8, but verses 35, in which Jesus had encouraged his disciples. And remember now, when Mark is writing his story, he's not unaware of who is listening to his gospel, that unless one takes up one's cross and follow after Jesus, one, of course, cannot truly be his disciple. Now, the line that is left out, which follows immediately, this would be verses 36 through 38, where Jesus says, is pictured as saying, "What profit is it for one to gain the whole world and to suffer the loss of their soul?" That is, to protect one's body, representing one aspect of what it means to be a person, but to really lose one's identity. Soul here, I know we speak of body and soul, but here soul meaning that which is the essence of what makes a person a person. And the verses continue to say that this adulterous and sinful generation seeks always to see a sign, and remember we had heard Jesus earlier on said that people asked for a sign, that he wasn't going to give them a sign, that the sign would be pay attention to and be caring for the message that Jesus was teaching. So that Jesus now cautions his listener, and it would be us, when the Son of Man comes in his glory, he will not be ashamed of those who have chosen to be his disciples. Remember, in the ancient world, that would be the world of Jesus' time, one of the great concerns was to always preserve honor and never to cause shame. So if one wanted to honor Jesus' ways, one should not be ashamed to carry out his message. We have noticed before, and I reiterate this a little bit, that Mark's community may still very much be expecting the coming of Jesus in glory. Now, the 10-cent word for this is called eschatology, the eschaton, the great coming. And it's against this background that the words here in verses 36 through 38 we might see are placed, that when Jesus, soon to come, will not be ashamed of us because we have not pursued and followed in his way. So all of that, I'm not quite sure why those lines are left out from last week's gospel, because they do make a kind of whole, but that concludes then, those three verses concludes chapter 8. Chapter 9 begins, and again, one notices that we're going to fill in the blank here for a little bit. Begins, obviously, with verse 1, which points out that some people were standing there who, and again the author says, will not see death until the coming of the Lord. So again, to reiterate the point I was just making, many did believe that the coming of Jesus in glory was imminent. And so Mark is saying, see, and so verse 1 here in chapter 9 is really connected with the previous verses. Be ready. Do not cause shame, either for fellow Christians and believers, but certainly for Jesus when he is and will come. This is called eschatology. Was very prevalent, we believe, in many of the Christian communities of the first century world. Chapter 2 through, not chapter 2, but verses 2 through 10 in chapter 9 are the story of the Transfiguration. Now, you will remember that in our liturgical arrangement, backing up to the season of Lent, that the second Sunday of Lent always uses as the gospel a story of the Transfiguration of Jesus. And so we're not going to go over that, because if you're interested, go back to our discussion for the second Sunday of Lent. That would have been in February the 28th of this year, 2021, to get kind of our reflections and the kind of understanding of the importance of Transfiguration. But even here, one can see that Jesus has told his disciples something very serious, and that there will be pain and suffering if one chooses to carry out the message that Jesus is teaching and living. And so some see then the story of the Transfiguration as a kind of, but see where it all will go to, see where it will all lead, that there will be a final glorious manifestation of Jesus as the risen Lord. But again, more details of the Transfiguration account can be found in that segment that we addressed earlier this year. Now, it picks up here with verse 11. So 1 through 10, or 2 through 10 really, are the story of, remember that Jesus is seen in a different light by 3 of his disciples, pictures them as coming down now from the place of Transfiguration, and Jesus instructing his disciples to tell no one of this until the Son of Man has risen. Now, why this? Well, there is, as I mentioned, the importance, and in Mark's story, he does not mention the resurrection, or have rather, remember, and go back again to our Easter discussions, has any accounts of the resurrection. But Jesus will rise, and Mark uses the word here that Jesus will rise, and hopes that they will be ready. Now, the discussion breaks out in this little section as the disciples say, but if you are the Messiah, when the Messiah comes, it will be preceded by the coming of Elijah. And this now becomes a little bit of the discussion in these verses. Jesus says that some will be standing here who will not see death until the Lord comes. Well, says the writer, or the disciples, one assumes that it would be the 3, and maybe it's the others. But Elijah must come first. So how can Jesus be the Messiah if Elijah hasn't come? Well, here's where Mark points out something that has been alluded to earlier on in his gospel, that indeed Elijah has come. And he has come and restored all things in the person of John the Baptist. See, so that's what's so very important with this little section, is to reassure not only the disciples but also the audience who hears Mark's gospel that indeed the prophecy that Elijah will come and that there will be a general resurrection of the dead on the day of the Lord is already now going to take place or has taken place. So if one can assume the correctness of saying that Elijah has come in the spirit and in power of John the Baptist, then Jesus certainly can be proclaimed as the Messiah. Now, this continues in verses 14 through 29. Jesus is presented now with a mute and deaf person. So although I've mentioned that he will not be doing too many more healing events or miracles, this, however, is one that takes place. And there are characteristics here of this man's situation that reminds one back of what happened earlier on when Jesus had also cured a man who had ranted and raged and had all kinds of problems that would, but here the man comes up, is thrown around. Many would suggest, and this is only because we might want to put a medical interpretation on what the problems of the man was, is that he was experiencing what we would call an epileptic fit. But Mark calls this an exorcism. In other words, some evil power or spirit has taken over Jesus. Now, I've mentioned this, or not Jesus, but this man. And I've mentioned this before, that although exorcisms say that there is some kind of force or experience or power within a person that is hurtful, we need, I think, to be careful when we say that a man is possessed, as if there were some outside, like the devil or some outside force that kind of evil grasps the man. Well, maybe that's, and there's a developed tradition that likes to reflect on that, but maybe that needs to be relooked at a little more carefully. But certainly, if one suffers the afflictions, say, of epilepsy, one is possessed, that there's a way in which man can't act the right way, he is jerked around, and it does look as if he's not acting his normal self, and that would be true. And so in that sense, a possession takes place. Well, in this case, Jesus calls out the unclean spirit. Jesus has been challenged. It's interesting that those around him say, if you can do this. Now, one of the things that Mark is always, I think, smiles a little bit to say, don't challenge Jesus like this. If you can do this, as if he can't. Or maybe that's the very thing that will motivate him to act if he were thinking not to act. So he cures the man. There's a little bit of drama as the bad spirit comes out and throws him around. It's a great story. In fact, it's one of the more descriptive stories that is found in Mark's gospel. And it is the only story that of the three synoptics that is told here. I shouldn't say that. When Matthew and Luke get it, they just say here, Mark was a little too wordy. We don't need all his description. And so they abbreviate it. So they do tell this account, but it gives a much different focus than in the rather colorful account. I'm sorry that it's not part of the scripture reading for this weekend, but that Mark, who is a good storyteller when he wants to be, with details in this case. What is important here, though, is that the disciples now come up to him and say, look, we tried to heal this man, and we couldn't. And people are looking around and saying, why couldn't the disciples bring the healing that this man needed to be? And the conclusion that Jesus says is, well, this kind of healing can only be achieved by prayer. Now, some text of this passage, as one moves into the Middle Ages, will see that it says can only be accomplished by prayer and fasting. Some older translations of this passage in the New Testament perhaps still have that. But what we really suspect is that the idea of fasting was added on in the Middle Ages, when fasting had become a pretty important part of much Christian practice, particularly during the season of Lent. And so somebody said, we'll call it prayer and fasting. Current texts, the texts as we now have them, do not have that word. Now that's that idea. So that's a little bit of an aside on that. What is important about this whole episode is that the persons who are asking for Jesus' healing have faith that he can do it, and it is also a wonderful illustration of the power of Jesus. So some might call this a little, what we call Christology, a little way of looking at the gifts that Jesus had and the ability to heal that he has. But as I mentioned, this is probably the last time now in Mark's story that we're going to have a healing account. Having said that, you're going to tell me later on there's a story where he cures a blind man. So I'm saying for the better part of this journey. Now, finally, verses 30 through 37, which is where we're going for this weekend. Jesus has, I've mentioned, begun this long journey south. He passes through the Galilee, but very quietly, avoids public notice, concentrates on his chief task, and this is the point that I'd like to make, the instruction of his disciples. So much of the material now that we're going to be hearing over the next few weeks has to do with Jesus addressing messages, hoping that the understanding of the disciples will become clearer. It begins, this little section, with the second prophecy. And here's what it says. The Son of Man will be handed over into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, he will rise after 3 days. Now, of the 3 prediction stories, this is the shortest of the 3. And some of the details that, if you remember last time, are not included here. But there is a little difference also that is taking place in this prediction, that he will be handed over to men. Now, who are the men here? Well, this is an allusion, we believe, to the Romans, to the Gentiles, and to none other than Pontius Pilate, who will be responsible ultimately for Jesus' death. It's also an allusion that he will be, the text says, handed over. Another translation of that word is betrayed. And so this is the first time in Mark's story that an allusion is made that Jesus is going to be, handed over or betrayed. We know who that is because of what happens later on. At this point, it's not clear who that will be, but isn't that really a terrible thought? And that's why betrayal is so important, that someone who is close to you, a friend, is willing to do something like this. So that's the difference, if you want, and the point of emphasis of this second of 3 predictions. The disciples hear this, and they are afraid to ask what he means by this until he has risen from the dead. Now, keep in mind, of course, we know, because we already know the end of the story, what that means. But if you put it into the context of Jesus' teaching with his disciples, they don't know what this is all about. What does he mean he will rise again from the dead? Now, the episode continues, and this is what we will hear, that Jesus questions them as to what they were talking about as they are now making this journey. And they're kind of embarrassed. The text kind of indicates that they'd rather not tell Jesus what they've been talking about, but apparently it rises up. And the discussion, they say, was, who will be the greatest or the first in the kingdom of heaven? So this is kind of, Jesus has been talking about his being handed over. They're talking about who's going to be the greatest. So it's pictured, the scene that we see here is Jesus now sits down. Apparently he is back in Capernaum on this journey, as I said, that he's making, gathers together his disciples and brings into their midst a child. Now, it's important here, when Jesus brings a child into the setting with the disciples, that we need to put aside the idealization of childhood that arose in the 19th century. See, we kind of picture children as, oh, so precious to their parents. They're innocent, they're likable, they're cuddly. I mean, you all have pictures of the newborn baby or even the young child, for a kind of romantic picture. That's not the way in which children were understood in the first century world. Oh yes, I'm sure they were precious to their parents, but children had no social status or value whatsoever until adulthood. And so in that sense, children were nobodies. Not so much as we like to think that they were innocent and spoiled, but simply, and the statistics that we have, and we may have mentioned this before, but the statistics are that childhood was a very difficult and dangerous time in a person's life. The estimate is that anywhere from 30 to 40% of children born did not survive the first year of their life. And that by the time they came to adulthood, which would be about 12, another 30 to 40% of children died. Think about it, all kinds of childhood diseases, illnesses, for which there were no medicines or cures. So childhood in that sense often was a question of survival. But also, having said that, children were, as I said, have no standards or rights, were considered, and the term often is interchangeably used, like slaves or servants, had no rights. They were lucky that they could belong, but if anything happened to them, I may have mentioned this, I know I sometimes do to couples at the time of baptism, there were no child protection laws for those days. Families raised children, and sometimes members of families might not have liked the young child, did harm to him or her. Well, yes, I'm sure there were some recompenses for that, but not really. So when Jesus brings a child, now we don't know if the child is a male or female. That's interesting. Some commentators today have said we immediately assume that it would have been a boy. But why is that assumption so? Because we have a very masculine viewpoint. What if it were a young girl? Anyway, the child, and that might have made the point that Jesus was trying to make even more relevant, because if you had to have a choice of a boy or a girl child, you might want to have the boy child because he would carry on the name and the reputation of the family. So maybe if Jesus had chosen a girl, his point that I say to you, unless one becomes like a child, one cannot truly be my disciple. So notice, child has no social status, has no particular rights as we're accustomed to. Jesus turns the tables on this by saying the child, if is important, number one, and that's, I think, something to notice here, in fact, makes the child equal to the adult. That would be point 2 in the sight of God. And that indeed, if his disciples, remember the question that arose, who's the greatest in all of that, wants to truly be an emissary of the gospel for Jesus, would have to treat with respect and dignity every person. So this is a kind of powerful story in its own way, in which Jesus says to his disciples, now, are they to be like children, or are they little ones? Now, admittedly, the term little ones changes, the image a little bit, but little ones were those in society who were considered to have no rights or privileges, and therefore they were slaves, and therefore anyone could do anything, or anything could happen to them. So all of this is what we're asked to reflect on this time as the Gospel of Mark unfolds. The Book of Wisdom, which is the first reading, takes a little section from the wisdom writer who wrote the book around 50 years or so before the time of Jesus, takes material from the book of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 52 to 66, talks about the servant, and the point here is that the servant of God is tested by those around him to see if he will remain faithful. Will he be an honorable person who stands in opposition to the wrongdoing that's going on around him, and they're calling him out? So this little passage, if we listen to it this week, will say this. He denounces his community for their sinfulness, and he accuses them of not being faithful to their upbringing. So I think the purpose of this little section, which you have to kind of work to see this, is that Jesus is saying, even though there might be rejection on the part of others to Jesus' disciples because of the message that they are bearing, and ultimately to Jesus, if they stay faithful and loyal, that is what is going to be important, and people will notice it. The audience around will say, let's test him to see if we can break him down. Jesus is saying to his disciples, we're not going to let that happen. We're going to stand firm. We're going to stand faithful. We're going to stand loyal to the message that God has given us. So the servant will remain faithful. And others kind of say, and here's the last phrase here, they say, let's see whether God will help him. Now, this is very reminiscent, if one thinks of it, to words that were addressed to Jesus as he hung on the cross. So all of this is connected with this second prediction that Jesus is going to Jerusalem. He will be handed over. He will suffer. But to his disciples, greatness is not to be first, but is to be the servant, to bring respect and dignity to all. Well, that message remains just as important, I think, today as it did back then. So as we gather around the table of the Lord once again this weekend, sit as it were, he in our midst brings to us the children of needs, but gathers us also together as the children of the Father. Thank you, and have a good week.